Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The thinking atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist Podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
My friends, welcome to the next evolution in audio and video learning. The Great Courses Plus is now Wondrium. Wondrium has all the stuff that you've already come to love. Top-tier content from National Geographic, the Smithsonian, History, and others. But now there's a whole lot more. New and exciting programs like Wondrium Originals, collections from Kino Lorber, Craftsy, Magellan TV, documentaries like Children of Isis and Birth of Planet Earth. You know, I just interviewed Dr. Josh Bowen about Old Testament history and archaeology. That got me interested in Wondrium's A Guided Tour of Ancient Egypt. And that highlights everything from the artifacts to the temples of the gods, and of course how Egyptian beliefs influenced the later monotheistic faiths of Rome and Greece. That's the kind of stuff that I cannot wait for you to experience at Wondrium. Sign up now through my special URL to get this great offer, a 14-day free trial of unlimited access. Go now to wondrium.com/Seth. That's WONDRIUM.com/Seth. Wondrium.com/Seth. This show is often about taboo conversations or uncomfortable conversations for some. Uncomfortable conversations. It's a conversation that we've had years ago. We talked about this, but it was time that we came back to it because it's been on my mind, and I know that it's relevant. Not just to some people. This is relevant to everybody. We're going to talk about the eventual date and method of our death and medical aid in dying, assisted dying, death with dignity. Do we have, or do we give ourselves permission to decide when and how we finish our lives, especially in the wake of suffering or potential suffering? You come out of a religion and you talk about the fact that, well, I don't want to suffer for days, weeks, months, even years at the end of my life. I would rather go out when I still have my faculties, at least my mental faculties, before I'm miserable, before I'm bankrupt or I bankrupt my family. I want to go out on my own terms. And you say that out loud, especially to people who think that this is only God's decision. Only God gets to make that choice. Who do you think you are? Or you're just morbid, or maybe you've got a mental problem and you shouldn't be making those decisions because you're not of sound mind. I'm going to talk to 3 people who are part of the Final Exit Network. They were mentioned in a recent video that I did with Dave Warnock, who was diagnosed with ALS, and he is behind the Dying Out Loud campaign, where he says, carpe the fucking diem. That's his hashtag. I'm going to go out and make the most of the moments because I know that ALS is going to take everything from me eventually, right? I'm going to lose my ability to do anything. And before I get to the point where the cons outweigh the pros, I am going to make a decision to punch my own ticket, say goodbye on my own terms, and be done with life. I think this is an important conversation, and I wanted to go and talk to the Final Exit Network because that's the organization that Dave Warnock had mentioned to me, so it was on the top of my mind. That's coming up in just a few. I'm going to read an article. This was posted by the CBC. It released June 4th. The article says, the obituary last week may have caught some people's attention. Bob Wilson, 71, and his wife, Margie, 73, died on the same day, May 25th, at Charlottetown's Queen Elizabeth Hospital. They planned it that way. They went out on their own terms, said their son, Scott Wilson, sitting beside his sister, Nicole Hogan, in her sunny kitchen in Cumberland, overlooking the sparkling Northumberland Strait. The doctors told the Wilsons' 3 children they would be the first couple in PEI, or Prince Edward Island, to use medical assistance in dying at the same time. Although their parents handled their deaths privately, Scott and Nicole agreed to talk to CBC News about it, to celebrate their parents' bravery, and to try to reduce any stigma around medical aid in dying. Bob and Margie Wilson were lifelong partners, the love of each other's life, said Scott. They met at Prince of Wales College, now Holland College, in Charlottetown, and married 50 years ago. Just a cute, beautiful couple that loved each other immensely. They lived a really good life, Scott said. They were never apart. Bob was a solid, happy man, working first with his mother and then Margie at their real estate business. After Bob retired, the couple came to live with Nicole and her family. Margie worked alongside her husband at his business, but had suffered from the pain of multiple sclerosis for the last 30 years. Early on, it put her in a wheelchair. But when her grandchildren were born, she rallied and became very active, even walking several half marathons. In August of 2019, Bob was diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer that had spread to his lungs. Bob was determined to fight it and stick around as long as possible. He tried many different therapies, and he'd actually had some positive news that his cancer had stopped growing when Margie's MS flared up and put her in the hospital this past February. She didn't come home after that. The couple had been trying to look after one another, but they became run down and frail. They weren't able to winter in Alabama the last 2 years because of Bob's illness. The warm climate had helped Margie feel better. In hospital, Margie continued to go downhill. She didn't feel like eating or drinking much, and her weight plummeted. In mid-March, Margie told her family she was ready to die, and would do so naturally, and that they shouldn't try to revive her if the time came. She was just sick, and tired of being sick and tired, Scott said. It's a big shock to be told, I don't want to live anymore because my life is so miserable. The family decided they needed to support their mother in her decision. You might not personally like the decision, but from us, it's a selfish side that you don't want them to go and leave, Scott said. It wasn't about us anymore, said Nicole. Their father was also shocked, they said. I just remember seeing his face. When he heard the news, his heart, it was broken, Scott said. The love of his life was giving up. At the hospital, as the family was talking about options, including nursing care, Nicole heard about medical aid in dying. She mentioned it to her mother. We are definitely a family that is always about looking at what are all of our options. Let's explore all of our options, Nicole said. Margie told the family she'd like to choose assisted dying. Bob got all the assessments he needed if he also decided to choose assisted dying, but he didn't make a decision until May the 7th. He'd become increasingly frail, unsteady on his feet, and lacked an appetite. His pain was unbearable. He decided he and Margie would take their final milestone as a couple, an assisted death, together. He wanted to go with his love, Scott said. The pain of not going with her would have broken him. The hospital bed next to Margie was available, so it became Bob's. Scott and Nicole's brother, Tony, was permitted to travel from his home in Brooklyn, New York, to Prince Edward Island on compassionate grounds. Scott and Nicole said doctors checked in with the couple often to make sure they hadn't changed their minds. In the last weeks, the grandchildren gathered in their grandparents' room to keep them company, doing crafts and playing music. They reminisced about fun times the close-knit family had spent together. Nothing went unsaid. It was bittersweet, Scott said at the scene. I joked with my mom. I said, it's almost Romeo and Juliet without the poison, Scott said. We use humor in our family as a coping mechanism. In a way, there was somewhat of a relief that a decision had been made because it was very up and down. Margie lost consciousness in the days before, and the family thought she might die naturally before the agreed-upon date. They kept a vigil around the clock, with one or more of the 3 children always in the room with Bob and Margie for the week before they died. Nicole and Tony stayed awake most of the night on May 24th and into the early hours of the next day, watching the clock and counting down the hours they had left with their parents. We were just left with our own thoughts and emotions, she said. At 7 a.m. on May 25th, doctors came into the room for a final check. They took the family to a different room away from their parents and briefed them on the procedure. Even though Margie wasn't able to verbally consent, recent changes to the assisted dying law made it possible for doctors to carry out her wishes. Bob indicated to the doctors that he wanted to go through with it too. He was committed that, as they did in life, they would do this final step together, Scott said. They were both terminal. There was no coming out of the situation. They pushed the couple's beds together so they could be close. Nicole held her father's hand, and they said, I love you, to one another. First, doctors gave the couple injections that put them to sleep. After Bob was snoring peacefully, doctors gave them both a series of further injections over about 10 minutes. They died together, peacefully. You could just see the weight of all the pain and suffering was gone. Nicole said she wants people who are terminally ill to be aware that options do exist, and they should be informed of all choices available to them. Know that the option is available if you so choose, she said. My message is, really look at the quality of life and remember those happy times, and think of what's right for you as an individual rather than everybody else around you. There shouldn't be any judgment, she added. Scott said he wanted to share his parents' journey because he is immensely proud of them. I'm really proud of my parents and the hard decision they had to make. That takes a lot of guts, he said. The family is still in mourning, and they say they will have to adjust to all the firsts without their parents. Nicole's house is quiet without Bob and Margie living downstairs. She grips tightly the crocheted heart her father held as he died. I do sleep with it sometimes, she said. It's comfort. Beautiful piece from the CBC from June the 4th of this year. PEI couple who used medically assisted dying went out on their own terms, says family, in case you want to look it up on your own. I want to go deeper into the whole idea of medical aid in dying, assisted dying, physician-assisted dying, death with dignity, whatever you want to call it. And I have on tap 3 representatives from the Final Exit Network, Brian Reuter, Mary Ewert, and Lowry Brown. Can I get each of you to quickly introduce yourselves and what your role is with FEN?
I'm Brian Reuter, the president of Final Exit Network Board.
I'm Mary Ewert, Executive Director of Final Exit Network.
And I'm Lowry Brown, the Client Services Director for Final Exit Network's Exit Guide program.
I'll just start with devil's advocate question. Are you guys a death cult or what?
Well, I like to think, this is Mary, I like to think that we're a compassionate group of people. I think that we're anything but a death cult. We care about people who maybe are experiencing pain and suffering. And I suppose it's our somewhat natural impulse to want to lessen pain and suffering when we see it for those who don't want to experience it.
This is Lowry. I think we're very focused on choice. and that you can relieve a lot of suffering just by giving people the choice whether or not they wish to endure it.
Brian, you probably get some hate mail. I mean, people are accusing you of being obsessed with this sort of, I don't know, I think especially here in the United States, death is the taboo. Death is darkness. You're morbid if you think and talk and even do activism around anything involving death.
Yes, but I haven't got a lot of hate mail. What I did find as I got into the board and got more active was that my friends started to ask me questions about it. And I must say that as we talk to people about who we are and what we do, I find, especially among older people, they all have a feeling that they would like to have a nice option. They're not sure that they can. But no, I haven't had any hate mail to date.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. This has been on my mind. I'm trying not to talk. I don't want to drive my audience crazy as I've been talking and sort of navigating the death of a parent. But, he suffered at the end. He had pulmonary fibrosis. And obviously, I grieved at the idea that he was suffering. And the next step in that conversation is, what would I do? Like if I knew that the scarring of my lungs would cause me not to be able to get oxygen, what if I was given a cancer diagnosis that would result in much suffering and I knew there was no way out? What if I had ALS, like Dave Warnock, who I recently interviewed and released a video about? And I told Natalie, I wouldn't want to wait till I degenerate to the point where I'm useless or just in agony, right? I'm existing, my lungs draw breath, my heart is beating, but I'm not living. And in my own mind, one galvanizing thing about the crisis in my own family is, at least for me, I've had more resolve about the control I would want to take over how I go out.
What you just shared with us points to a couple of experiences that I've had that led me to the movement, really. One with my father dying of prostate cancer that went to his bones. And he was in great pain the last couple of days of his life. He was a very gentle man, and it was very difficult to see him in pain. The other story is my husband, who had ALS, and we were living in Europe at the time. He went to the Dignitas clinic, and he had that resolve from the time he was a young adult. I was unaware of the movement, but he had Derek Humphrey's book. And so when he did develop ALS, it was rather startling that he had already thought about this. He was a very rational individual, and him having the ability to take control of the end of his life was just an amazing thing. And I was so grateful that he didn't have to suffer in a way that he did not want to.
Can we have a point of clarification there? I'm not familiar with, is it Eric Humphrey? And what is the book? And what's all that about?
Derek Humphrey wrote the book Final Exit, and it's still in print. I think it was written in the 90s. Lowry probably knows more about the details of it. It was a very popular book. It went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, even though Derek had originally printed it on his own. And he based his beliefs on his experience with his wife, Jean, who had self-delivered when she suffered from breast cancer.
As I understand it, if we're thinking about the same book, then it was almost like stereo instructions in some way. Here's sort of how you can do it painlessly. It was a very practical guide to a final exit. For that reason, the book was deemed extremely controversial. Are we talking about the same thing?
So Derek Humphrey believed that everybody should have the ability to end their life on their own terms if they wanted to. And so he provided the final exit as a way to peacefully end your life. And there was a second book that came out after that called The Peaceful Pill that has a large number of different ways for people to end their life peacefully. It's done by Philip Nitsky, and it's an online book that anybody can get.
I almost feel like there's an underground. You know what? I'm convinced there's an underground of people who they're wrestling with this, but it is almost the thing you do not speak of.
Yeah, this is Lowry. I think it's often called an underground simply because so many people have not taken the time to think about death until they're looking it in the eye themselves or they see an ugly death within the family. But it is a small grassroots movement, and it has been getting bigger and bigger and bigger as more and more of us are watching deaths that we would not want to endure ourselves.
I was just going to say, Seth, we often say that you're one bad death away from becoming a member of this underground cult.
Everybody is facing it. You know, it was Christopher Hitchens that said, nobody beats these odds. We're all on the clock. And I'm interested that some people don't want to think about it. Perhaps they construct the happy ending that, well, suffering in this life brings us greater bliss in the next life. I think that's kind of a tragic thing. And some people embrace it and say, well, it's coming. Let's prepare for it. I'll ask you this, Lowry Brown, do you use the word suicide? A lot of stigma with the S word.
There is a lot of stigma with the S word. We prefer to use terminology like self-deliverance or a hastened death. That said, what's written into the laws uses the word suicide. So we do use that terminology from time to time. If you look at the definition of suicide, it basically includes two things: a conscious choice and an act, an intent and an act. There's no judgment in the word itself if you look at the definition, but you're absolutely right that society has layered a lot of judgment onto it. So we avoid it when it's easy to do so.
I've seen some people, they avoid the phrasing commit suicide. They died by suicide. Commit sounds like committing a crime, and I think many people consider it a kind of crime. There are certainly spiritual penalties for those of us who came out of the church. I speak to a lot of ex-Catholics. Well, I speak to a lot of practicing Catholics. And ending your life, even if you're at the end of life, even if you are heaving and suffering and all those types of things, if you pull the plug a little bit early on your own terms, that is considered a mortal sin. Any of you have that kind of background? Anybody have that kind of baggage that you had to deal with?
For the first 30 years of my life, I believe that. That's for sure.
You thought God would send you to hell if you took life and death into your own hands.
Yes, that's true. I was raised about Catholic and told that, that was the worst sin you could have was to commit suicide.
Go ahead, Mary.
I also come from a similar background to Brian. I went to Catholic school, sometimes Catholic girls' school, for a total of 16 years. So I think it was my introduction to my very rational husband-to-be led me to question and then step away from the dogma.
I saw there was somebody in my own circle, I won't go into any details, but they didn't take their own life, but they knew that the end was near. They had a degenerative disease. There was no way out. They knew they could have these expensive and life-prolonging treatments, but they would still be in pretty bad discomfort and almost no quality of life. And so they just stopped treatment, right? And I've been interested to contrast that. You can make the decision to withdraw all medical intervention so that you will die sooner. It's inevitable. You are going to die. Let's call it weeks, maybe a month, 6 weeks, 2 months, whatever. How is that different from saying, okay, well, now I am going to peacefully fall asleep without all of the degeneration and the suffering, etc.? And I think this is an interesting conversation to have with the people who are accusing people like you, people at Final Exit, people who take life-death decisions into their own hands. They accuse them of playing God. Anybody want to speak to that?
Well, I could certainly, this is Lowry, a parrot, Dave Warnock, who you recently interviewed, who points out that we've been playing God throughout life. If we are intervening medically, if we're seeking treatments, maybe that's not what God had in mind and we're thwarting God's will. I do find it a bit irrational to say that to take these actions at one time is absolutely fine and has nothing to do with God's will, but if I'm going to take these actions with regard to my health later, that's somehow playing God and thwarting God's will.
So by actually intervening in what looks like a natural physical process, which might be God's plan for me, by going to science-based medicine and saying, well, intervene, that could also be construed as playing God.
And why not? The question you ask, I think, is a very good one. And we as humans are very good at drawing bizarre boundaries that don't really exist. If I'm recalling correctly, Justice Scalia, of all people, agrees with you and in one of his orders has some quote to the effect of, at the end of the day, is there really a difference between stopping certain medical treatments, and then he says something else, and then, failing to turn the car off when you drive into the garage. Is there really a difference there?
Have any or all of you sat at someone's side as they drank the cocktail and breathed their last breath?
Lowry and I are both senior guides, so we've been at a number of deaths. Mary has taken the training, but I don't think Mary has been at one of our deaths. She was, of course, with her husband, but we've certainly been with a number of people who have died under the education of our program.
So, without betraying anybody's confidence, tell me about it. Well, what's it like?
I was simply going to clarify that the method of self-deliverance that we teach is the use of inert gas.
I see.
So we do not work under the medical model, which is partly what allows us to work in all 50 states and the District of Columbia.
So you're saying there are greater restrictions for those who would have a, I want to say phenobarbital, but it's something else. There's a series of medications or drugs that will relax you into a state of unconsciousness before stopping your lungs and heart. That is not your model.
Those drugs are highly, highly regulated. They are extremely difficult to get. Medical aid in dying laws, where they exist, are very helpful in that you can get a physician to legally prescribe them. But those laws are very limited to people who are only within 6 months of death. You have to be a resident of the state. And as people like Dave Warnock have explained, by the time he's within 6 months of death, he may not be able to swallow. So while medical aid in dying laws are wonderful, they don't meet a lot of the need out there. So there's diseases like the neurodegenerative diseases. But also these days, dementia is a disease that really, really scares people as it gets to the heart of who we are and who we consider ourselves to be. With dementia, by the time you're within 6 months of death, you're no longer competent. You can't access medical aid in dying laws.
You're not spatially aware. How can you make life-death decisions with kind of a broken brain? I was interested in a book that was recommended to me by you, Brian, called The Inevitable by Katie Engelhardt. And she had a great point, because even the laws that say, well, you have 6 months to live, that's a hugely subjective prognosis. You can guess, well, we think you've got 6 months, but what if it's 7? What if it's 6 months and 2 days? This is a big gray area that becomes problematic whenever you get physicians trying to decide who does and who doesn't qualify for medical aid in dying, right?
I should also point out, as Lowry said, to meet our requirements, you do not have to be terminally ill in that definition. So we provide education to people who have intolerable suffering, but they're not necessarily terminal. That's why we can work with Dave and people with dementia.
And your point, Seth, this is Lowry, is absolutely accurate. 6 months is putting your finger into the wind kind of thing. And interestingly, the more a doctor has worked with a patient, in general, the more optimistic their prognoses become, which means that the closer to death you get, the longer you've worked with the doctor, the longer the doctor is likely to predict that you have to live, which just makes it all the more complicated.
So, Seth, if I can, I'd like to come back to your question about what does it feel like? And I'd like to tell you a story about a woman in Los Angeles that requested our services. She was in mid-80s, a fantastic artist, quite a renowned artist, had 4 children, and she was violently independent and was ready to die. She had a number of medical issues, but she passed our qualification. They set up a day where people flew in from around the world for everybody to get together to say goodbye to her. When we walked into the room, they had champagne, they had cheese, they were all there, very sorrowful, but they were all having a nice exchange. They spent 4 hours, all these people telling her goodbye. And then when the time came that she decided to die, they all came into the room together with us. And before she pulled the hood down, she said, "Goodbye to everyone, I love you all." It was one of the most beautiful deaths that I've ever been around. And I would just say that everybody in the room was moved because they got a chance to say goodbye to this marvelous person in a very personal way. They got to celebrate her death like they celebrate life. And I would just say it was one of those things that stays with me to this day.
I'm not being morbid, but I have been so fascinated that I have, there was a BBC documentary about death with dignity or right to die issues involving he was a successful business owner who had a degenerative disease which had really advanced, and he just decided, I'm going to, while I still have my mind and some of my body, I'm going to check out on my own terms. And so they brought him into his own living room. They had cameras rolling with his permission and blessing, and he sipped some cocktail, and within 2 minutes he was asleep, and his wife was sitting next to him holding his hand, and there was something, I guess the word dignified, about the fact that, he wasn't lying in a vegetative state. He wasn't wasting away in a hospital bed, merely existing, totally unaware of what was happening around him. He knew he had control. And even though it's a very sobering piece, it was, as I understand it, one of the highest rated TV documentary episodes in Britain up to that time. And perhaps even now, people are genuinely interested.
I just wanted to ask you, was that the Louis Theroux?
No, his name is Terry something.
Okay.
I'll look it up while you're speaking. Lowry, did you
Terry Pratchett?
Yeah, Terry Pratchett. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I just might jump in on this concept of dignity, which, as Katie Engelhart points out, is far more elusive than it might sound, and yet also sort of practical. You mentioned the idea of being in control. People often look at the method of self-deliverance that we teach and get a little creeped out by the idea of a bag or a tank. And I think when you get down to the depth of what dignity is, it's the ability to make one's own choice, to sail one's own ship. And that things like the outward accoutrements are much less important, but that when you talk about control, you're getting to the heart of what that means for dignity in the human experience.
I think also it's a protective mechanism as you read the stories of people who become desperate. There was one story of a guy, he had no medical aid and dying option. He knew his life was going to end in suffering. He notified the police that he was going to do this, and then he shot himself. And some people do that, not what the word is, I guess, incorrectly, and survive, but barely in a vegetative state. There's so many ways to screw this up. That's terrifying.
I had a client early on who had dementia, and he was a university professor, loved hunting, loved hiking. And he told us that had we not come along, he was planning to take a gun and shoot himself because he would not live with his brain not functioning, because all of his life, that's who he was his brain and his thinking power. And he was so thankful for us because he too didn't want to screw up and didn't want to use a gun to do that.
More to come with my special guest. I want to get into depression. If you have no terminal disease, but you just don't want to live, how does that work when it comes to end-of-life issues and autonomy and the right to choose to die, etc.? I also want to get into this slippery slope argument that I hear quite a bit. Before you know it, there'll be death panels. When people become inconvenient, we'll just send them off to die kind of deal. I don't know, we have lots to do. We will continue our conversation in just a second. So I had these little patches, about a foot in diameter, these dead spots in my yard. I don't know what causes this. I don't know how to fix it. But I was kind of tired of my yard looking like it had smallpox, right? So my solution was a customized lawn care plan from Sunday. They do know how to fix this stuff. Sunday analyzed my whole property. I just typed in my home address online at getsunday.com, and then they sent me back a rundown of their recommendations for lawn care and pest control. They even knew the type of soil, the climate data for where I live, irrigation needs based on Oklahoma weather or whatever. And then they shipped everything I needed right to my door. Everything I need for a lovely lawn, including patching up those spots to make everything even and green and awesome. For a guy who is not a lawn guy, Sunday is perfect for me. I just needed a few minutes and a garden hose. Sunday provided the expertise and the materials without the unwanted and potentially harmful chemicals. Let Sunday take the guesswork out of growing a greener and more beautiful lawn. Visit getsunday.com/Seth to get $20 off your custom lawn plan at checkout. That's $20 off your custom plan at getsunday.com/Seth. If you want the show early and commercial-free, become a patron at patreon.com/Seth Andrews. Continuing a conversation with my special guest from the Final Exit Network, the website finalexitnetwork.org. They consider themselves educators and advocates fighting for end-of-life autonomy. From FEN, I'm speaking with Brian Reuter, Mary Ewert, and Lowry Brown. All right, you said you don't have to have a terminal disease to qualify for assistance through FEN. Let's say I'm just depressed. I've got depression, I feel sad, I'm in a valley. Are those people on your radar? How do you deal with these? Because it's one of the major protests for aid in dying issues. Well, what happens if you have someone who just needs help? And yet they're in a valley and they're hopeless, and now they decide, hey, I'm going to end it all. Do you participate in that scenario at all?
We do not currently support applications for guide support that are based solely on a mental health complaint. We do recognize that mental health diagnoses can seriously debilitate quality of life and that the medical options available do not help everyone. But for the moment, those applications are very difficult to evaluate, and the society in which we operate does not yet recognize mental health diagnoses as being the same as physical diagnoses. So, no, we do not accept applications based on a mental health complaint.
Seth, I was just going to say that in the Netherlands, they do actually, as a part of their law, allow people with mental illness to be able to be euthanized. So it is happening in other parts of the world. It's just that the United States is a very Christian country that is very, very, what's the right word?
Less enlightened, perhaps?
Skeptical of anything having to do with hastening death.
Well, what's the difference between what you do and straight up euthanasia? You use the word, right? You're taking the life of a patient who has an incurable disease or an irreversible coma or a degenerative condition. Euthanasia, as I understand it, is illegal in most countries. How's that different from what you do?
Euthanasia is actually legal in a number of countries that allow for medical aid in dying. Typically, that term is used specifically for when the doctor injects a lethal medication directly, whereas a self-deliverance or physician-assisted dying is where the doctor would prescribe medication and the patient would self-ingest. What we do is much closer to that, except that we do not provide the means and we do not provide any physical assistance, so that anybody we work with has to do everything themselves. It's their journey. We simply guide them.
One of the protests I hear is, well, why taint the medical profession? Do you think doctors should be involved? You know, what's that? The Hippocratic Oath, right? Do no harm. But then we have to define harm. Part of me thinks I'd kind of want a medical professional involved if the law would allow, just for protective reasons. Do you think we should have doctors involved?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on that. I don't know if you're familiar with Margaret Batten. She's an academic who has written extensively on aid in dying. And her viewpoint is that doing no harm includes alleviating suffering. And that has been my personal perspective as well. I think that saying doctors can do no harm, harm could be watching a patient suffer for days and days in pain, unable to breathe. The other point I wanted to make, going back to the discussion about depression, is that there's a sort of side issue there where people will say, well, isn't someone who is accessing aid in dying actually depressed? And I think, there's an element of sadness for people who have a life-threatening illness. So, of course, some people may feel sadness. That isn't the same as chronic depression.
How do you handle the slippery slope protests? Well, once we start, before you know it, we're going to start thinning the herd in the name of convenience. We're going to be a culture that celebrates. There will be death panels. I'm sure you've heard these. How do you respond?
Well, this is Mary again. I think that Justice Rehnquist mentioned the slippery slope, and he said that vulnerable groups would eventually suffer abuse, neglect, and mistakes. And my feeling is there are many things that we as a society could be doing to assist people, and we don't. So I don't know. I think we already are on a slippery slope insofar as providing food, assistance, etc., to people in need. So the idea of a slippery slope, I think, is it's just words, and it's to make people doubt.
Isn't everything a slippery slope? You could look at everything we do and say, well, this could lead to X, right?
Well, if you allow caffeine, I mean, then all of a sudden everybody's going to be hooked on meth. So coffee should definitely be outlawed.
Well, and I felt that, it was really difficult watching discussions about the opioid crisis because many people are dying of opioid abuse. And in my mind, I was thinking, I hope this doesn't become a reason to restrict opioids so much that people in pain actually can't access the medication. So
I'll ask a question that somebody in my audience or somebody somewhere may be asking to themselves. Are you just morbid people thinking about death? You don't just sit around and you're wearing all black with the lights dimmed down to 10% and playing, music in minor chords, thinking about the end. How would you respond to people who say that you're just obsessed with death?
So Mary, I think that I've heard Brian say, it's one of the happiest groups of people he's known. I just think that when we're a group of people who work from a basis of rationality, and we know our feelings, we know our desires, and we're able to be happy because we're not enchained by dogma.
If I can speak to an earlier point, you had mentioned that a lot of people who have an aid in dying option don't use it, but it is the fact that they have the option that gives them comfort and improves their quality of life. The realization that they have control actually, for some people, helps them to perhaps extract more goodness before they finally do exit, right?
You get to the core of what we do. This is Lowry. We see that time and time again. People call us, they're interested in guide support, they want to die tomorrow. And again, somewhere along the process, they relax, they can get on with what's left of their life, they can enjoy it. Many choose not to exit at all. It's one of the blessings that I think makes us feel so rewarded in what we do.
And Seth, I was just going to say, I think when you said control, you put it at the essence of who we are and who our clients are. It's people who do want to control their end days on their terms. And so I think that's the one characteristic that almost all of us have and almost all of our clients. We like control. I tell everyone, I'm 80 years old. I walk 5 miles a day. I don't take any medication. But I don't want a doctor to decide when I die. I don't want to waste a lot of money staying alive another 6 months, and I don't want to suffer. And so, I'm going to do everything I can to live as long as I can, but I don't want to suffer, and I will end my life on my terms.
For an ex-religious guy, I told Natalie I don't want some Iron Age primitive. I don't sit around thinking about death all the time, but I'm not afraid of it. Isn't that weird? Like you guys, you deal with death. You see people who pass away, but I'm not afraid of it.
Yeah, so I have a question for you, Seth.
Uh-oh.
So, as you think about being a good Christian and thinking about going to heaven, don't you think there should be a celebration around death that says, okay, I'm getting ready to go meet my God? And yet, if you sit down and think about and watch most Christian deaths, it's a very morbid, very sad sort of thing as opposed to a celebration. And I always find that to be somewhat of a contradiction. So I'm curious about your thoughts.
In my own life, I was terrified of death until I left religion, which is weird because, they promised me I was going to go and I can get a mansion, and there's going to be the streets made of gold and fences made of pearls, and there will be white light from the sky and music and goodness, and there will be no pain, no suffering, none of that stuff. And it was all in the abstract in my mind. I really didn't even have a good picture mentally of what heaven would look like. And I think everybody's picture is different based on their perceptions, culture, desires. But I found myself always thinking, well, man, I sure don't want to die, And I want to live a full life now, but I don't look at it with terror. And non-existence doesn't bother me. I think what bothers me is the process of dying. The idea of languishing in a bed, with bed sores and tubes coming in and out of me, and something we haven't yet spoken about, the monumental, often bankrupting expense that would come along as I do what? Give myself an extra few months of lying in that bed with the bed sores? That's not how I want to go out. It's not a burden I want to leave with my people. I mean, the financial aspect, I guess this sounds a little cold and clinical, but that certainly figures into the equation. Some people are like, if I do this to the tune of $15,000 a month, my family will be destitute. I don't want to do that to them before I go, right?
There's the financial cost, but there's also the cost to the caretakers and the family of watching someone suffer. It does impact on people, and it marks people, sometimes for a very long time. I remember going into a charity shop in England that was part of a hospice organization, and I mentioned to the woman that my husband had ALS, and she said, "Oh, my husband died of that, and it was terrible." And you could tell that she hadn't really been able to recover from watching that process. So I think in addition to financial burden, there's, the burden of watching pain and suffering, especially if the patient is not desiring that.
Well, and I think that's also, this is Lowry, one of the important points, that we think of our lives as a story, and that's how our brains work. And of course, in stories, endings matter. They matter deeply. And so I think so many of us, as you said, don't want that to be our final chapter. We want to walk out on our own 2 feet to some extent.
I'm totally stealing that. Our lives are a story, and how it ends is, I'm totally stealing that. That's brilliant. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, over the last year or two, we have done a little bit of research on some of our clients and looked at some of the psychosocial issues surrounding their desire to hasten their death. And the things you mentioned are all in their minds. They don't want to be a burden. They don't want to run out of money. And those are side limits. They've got pain. They've got intolerable suffering. But those are very big factors as to when they might want to die, because they too have looked at these things and say, I don't want to end up in a nursing home at $15,000 a month. I don't want to be a burden to my kids. And as our population ages, we're going to see more and more of that. And so it's real, and we're doing this research in anticipation that will broaden the discussion around why people want to hasten their death.
I guess this also speaks to, that's not a dark side, but we see all the advances in medical technology, these life-extending advances, which we are so thankful for. But, there occasionally is a downside, because if you can keep somebody breathing longer, it doesn't mean they're really necessarily living. As we draw this conversation to a close, I have found in my own life that conversations about the finality of death and kind of how I want to go have added an urgency and even a joy to the moments I am alive. I know this sounds like a Lifetime movie, and I don't mean for it to, but this has to be the case for you. One thing about looking at the fact that we're on the clock and the moments are precious, whether or not you believe in a life 2.0, an afterlife, posthumous existence or not, knowing that this life is finite adds a real urgency to seize the day. Forgive the cliches, but do any of you want to speak to that? Seize the day?
You are a wonderfully original man, but that is not an original thought. It has been coming up from Seneca to Montaigne to Rilke, that in fact an appreciation of our mortality allows us to therefore appreciate the time we have in a way that can make our lives much richer, not in a morbid sense, but in a way that allows us to appreciate the moments and the delights as they go by without focusing so much on this imaginary future that we don't really know about.
Mary, given your experiences, even your losses, do you find an urgency to the days now?
I feel a peacefulness in living in the moment, which I have spent quite a lot of time trying to train myself to do. I'm not yet totally successful, but I do think, as Lowry said, rather than looking to the future or bemoaning the past, the idea of just living in the present and accomplishing what you can in the moment is how I try to live.
That's reminiscent of some of the stuff I like. I'm not a Buddhist, but there's kind of a Buddhist philosophy about mindfulness and being in the moment that I've always really liked.
I always think about it this way. The first 30 years of my life, I lived in fear of death because of this whole mortal sin, going to heaven and going to hell, and I worried about it. At some point when I was around 30, I discovered that, that all the things that I believed in, instead of saying I was doing it because it might put me in heaven or hell, I did it because it was the right thing, and I decided I wanted to enjoy every day of my life and know that I had control of the end of my life. And so it's made my life much, much richer, and I just feel, I enjoy every day and don't worry anymore about it, because at any point in time that I decide, I can end my life on my terms.
I guess obsessing over that eventual date does seem to cheat us a little bit of, as Mary said, being in the moment. I mean, if it's eventually going to come, I don't find a whole lot of utility in fixating on the what if. You drive yourself crazy. You prepare for it. You plan for it. You take as much control as you can over it. But then you realize, well, I'm alive and I'm still here. I'm still kicking. I probably need to make the most of the time that I have. Brian, what's the website for people who might be interested in finding out more about the organization and what you do?
It's finalexitnetwork.org. And I would ask all of your followers to come and put their email address in. They'll get our quarterly magazine and see, stories about people that have been using our services and see their reaction, because I think a lot of your followers will have parents these days who are going to be facing some of these issues. And all I would say is go to the site, sign up for our magazine, and look at our services, and then consider, whether or not this is something that your families might benefit from.
Mary, Lowry, or Brian, any final thoughts? Anything we missed? Anything you brought to the table that I haven't covered yet?
Well, discussion can always carry on, but I just want to thank you for bringing this issue to your viewers and giving us the space to talk about it a little bit today.
Talking about the taboo is just what we do around here. And I'd like to see it destigmatized. If you'd have told me about this kind of stuff even 12, 13 years ago, I probably would have been scandalized. I would have thought, it's a death cult, or you're just morbid people, or it is a slippery slope, and before you know it, we'll have the tribunals come in to decide who lives and who dies. I mean, I very much came out of that culture. If you'd have told me that, I would now be thinking, well, yeah, I think I would like to, before my suffering begins one day, or, before it gets too bad, I would like to decide the where and the when. I'd like to decide who will be in attendance. I'd like to have my favorite song playing in the background. I'd like to enjoy my favorite meal. I'd like to put a punctuation mark. I think in the book, The Inevitable, she uses the term life completion. And I kind of like that term, life completion. And now I don't find it morbid. Now I think, well, now I'm not in denial, or now I'm not looking away or misrepresenting really what is a fact of life for all living creatures. And I think it's healthy. So it's been a real pleasure to be able to have that conversation.
So Seth, my last statement is, I've always thought I want to be at my memorial to hear what people say about me. And this gives me a chance to do that.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. You get to hear the tribute. That's cool. Lowry, did you have any final thoughts?
I think you're absolutely right that destigmatization is important, because that does allow individuals to plan and bring their loved ones together and talk about it and say goodbye. Whereas if you're constantly pretending that somebody's going to live forever, as though acknowledging that their death is imminent, there's all of these wonderful bonding things that can't happen. And so I think the more we talk about it, the better we'll die.
I wanted to go straight to the source on this one. I could read third-party articles, and I could wallow in this shallow pool of conjecture, or I can contact people who are on the front lines, and that is you. Mary Ewert, Lowry Brown, Brian Reuter from the Final Exit Network, thanks for having a conversation. It is my hope that this will translate into conversations among members of the audience and maybe into their circles as well. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.